Hello everyone. Today I'd like to discuss the ongoing efforts here in the UK to increase the surveillance over our society. When we try to compare our own society to a fictional dystopia, the typical reference is to the permanent surveillance state of George Orwell's 1984. However, I also see the links to Aldous Huxley's Brave New World, a society led by figures known as world controllers, where humans are conditioned from an early age to believe in an ordered society which replaces strong emotions and the fundamental freedoms we enjoy in our own reality with comfort and consistent streams of pleasure. We live in a world where we are terminally online, conditioning ourselves like mice in a lab experiment to keep clicking and scrolling for the next minuscule hit of dopamine. In turn, most of us either have a lack of awareness of the freedoms we are losing, or we are stripped of the energy and will to do anything about it, instead feeling powerless or focusing on an accumulation of social media attention in place of meaningful action. In the day-to-day life of the UK, we have our fundamental freedoms. We can technically speak out against the people and issues we disagree with to an extent. I am able to publish this work due to the existence of those very freedoms. However, much like 1984, there are a number of areas where these freedoms are being rapidly eroded in real time. And much like Brave New World, many of us are inclined to lean into a consistent flow of pleasure to avoid the steps being taken to restrict the freedoms we enjoy. In this video, I'd like to focus on a number of areas where the British government have taken steps to restrict our freedoms in the name of security, namely technological restrictions which have severe impacts in our ever more online reality. The idea of facial recognition cameras everywhere seems like something out of a dystopian film. However, most of us use facial recognition on a daily basis every time we unlock our phones. We have already handed over our facial recognition data to tech companies, so the government see it as fair game to analyse our faces without us even knowing. In the 18th century, English philosopher Jeremy Bentham developed the idea of what he called the panopticon, an observation platform where prisoners could be observed at any time. In Bentham's conception, the one prison guard on duty could not observe all prisoners at once, but the prisoners never knew if they were being observed, so the idea went that their behaviour would be altered at all times in the event that they were being watched. Now, while Bentham developed this architectural design, and thinkers such as Lacan and Foucault in the 20th century considered this the pinnacle of surveillance overreach, facial recognition technology goes far beyond the conceptions of Jeremy Bentham and into a far darker reality. Facial recognition ensures that not only will we not know if we are being observed, but everyone can be observed at all times. Picture Bentham's panopticon, but with a dedicated guard for every single prisoner. Facial recognition works like our phone cameras, but on a much larger, more sophisticated scale. Think of it like your phone camera being able to identify you out of hundreds of people from hundreds of metres away. Facial recognition cameras have been rolled out across London and South Wales, with large events such as Notting Hill Carnival undergoing intensive camera analysis. Like any form of surveillance, many may say that if they have nothing to hide, they have nothing to fear. But in the case of facial recognition, this is a misinformed approach for anyone to take. A key risk of this technology is the ability for false identifications to take place. We have seen many instances of this happening. In fact, data collected by the Met Police and the South Wales Police Force show that nearly 90% of the time, there is a false positive match on facial recognition IDs. Police forces regularly oppose these statistics when confronted with them, citing instead the statistics of successful arrests. However, I doubt many falsely stopped by a police force will be comforted by the knowledge that sometimes the technology gets it right, particularly those belonging to groups regularly targeted by the police. The public theoretically has the right to refuse this technology being used on them. However, we have seen instances of members of the public being apprehended by police when covering their face in front of live facial recognition cameras, and little effort from police officers when trying to make the public aware they are being recorded, something they are supposed to take adequate measures to do so. Many sociologists and psychologists have written on the abuse of police power, and a common consensus among them is that often those in positions of authority commit acts of abuse and overreach because they are not only encouraged to do so, but because they know they can do so with little to no consequences. It follows then that the police would revel at the opportunity to use technology which makes their job easier with little regard for the state overreach at play. You may want to comfort yourself in the idea that if you were falsely ID'd by facial recognition technology, you would simply be let go by the police. However, Big Brother Watch found in many instances that when falsely identified, people were often asked to provide additional information such as fingerprints, handing over even more information to the police despite their innocence. As with many technology implementations, facial recognition has also been found to have racial bias, being much more likely to falsely identify those from non-white ethnic backgrounds. This results in even more over-policing of predominantly non-white communities. Regarding the storing of data, there is little oversight as to how safely this is stored, as the police can keep the faces of even innocent citizens on the police national database. The Home Office have even been questioned about the use of facial recognition to capture images of children and the storing of this data. The storing of all of this data, particularly of those under 18, poses a significant threat of hacking and exposure. Whether it's predators themselves or those aiming to sell images to predators, there is a legitimate risk of millions of images being readily available to anyone who can access whichever government database this information is stored on. Offices such as the Passport Office and the DVLA also hold images of millions of adults, so this isn't a brand new issue. However, with the rise of cybersecurity threats, having yet another database of images is a concern. There is no doubt that facial recognition can be a positive in the role of policing. It can significantly speed up the arresting process, it allows business owners to crack down on theft, and in violent cases where CCTV is paramount for the prosecuting evidence, facial recognition technology can provide a vital piece of evidence. I am not fundamentally against the use of this technology. If I was violently assaulted and facial recognition cameras were able to identify the perpetrator, I would be grateful for its presence. In fact, public opinion data collected suggests that the majority of adults in England and Wales are in fact in favour of the use of facial recognition technology. Public opinion doesn't disprove the potential risks around this technology, but it does highlight that there may not be the opposition to it some may think, particularly those reading about these issues in other countries. However, like any form of surveillance, it is entirely dependent on how it is being used and by who. Besides the opportunities for government overreach and the potential mishandling of our information, there is a wider impact of surveillance. Michel Foucault discussed this in his book Discipline and Punish. He theorised that when surveillance becomes so prevalent, we begin to correct our own behaviour and survey the behaviour of those around us. Knowing we are being watched will make us an even more paranoid and insular society. On the 25th of September 2025, the UK government announced plans for a mandatory digital ID, an electronic pass to be carried by all UK residents as an even more thorough form of identification. The government have said this is to combat illegal immigration and illegal working practices. However, policymakers and campaigners alike have noted that anyone coming into the country or working in the UK illegally already has no ability to acquire a passport, driver's licence or any other form of official identification. Those working here illegally are also often paid in cash in exchange for accommodation or are not paid at all. In addition, foreign workers are already required to obtain an electronic code to work in the UK, so a digital ID doesn't resolve any of these issues. There are a number of risks with a digital ID. If a data breach occurs, the details of millions of residents could be stolen and sold to illegal third parties. This not only risks the information for residents, but may also cost the government millions of pounds and a significant waste of time and resources. There is also the inevitable danger of digital IDs being expanded in their use. They may begin for use in employment practices, however this may quickly be expanded to voting, access to welfare and even healthcare. This can lead to people being excluded from services. There's also a larger discussion to be had on those with disabilities and the elderly. Millions of people across the UK are not confident in their use of technology or are literally incapable of using modern technologies such as smartphones. Therefore, requiring everyone to have a digital ID on their phone will no doubt lead to many being excluded from essential services. It's clear to me that digital ID is yet another example in the long line of failed public-private partnerships by the British government. In October 2023, the government passed the Online Safety Act. On first sight, this piece of legislation appears to have noble intentions to keep our young people safe online. We saw this legislation come into action in 2025, where adult content websites were age restricted. On the surface, I agree with this move from the government, as I know the damaging impact this content can have on teenagers. However, the rollout of this legislation has been a mishap from the jump. Third-party verification sites have been allowed to take the details anyone willing to share their information offers up, be that their credit card, license, or facial recognition data. While many of these companies claim they will only hold on to this data temporarily, we have heard this from many companies in the past who have continually gone on to sell this data. The dangers of restricting access to the internet cannot go understated. The risk that it is not only used for adult content, and that all websites will require some form of information handover to access, regardless of age. Currently, the use of VPNs bypasses these restrictions, and almost every young person is smart enough with technology to know how to use these. However, it is not long before the government consider a restriction on the download and use of such VPNs. Many may not consider this an issue. However, a restriction on what content we can and cannot see without giving up our information is a fundamental right we must hold on to. Many countries have undergone internet restrictions at the hands of authoritarian governments, and activist groups from these nations continually advocate for tearing down of said restrictions. The most recognised example of a country installing internet restrictions is the famous Great Firewall of China. However, the Chinese government are aware that their citizens can still use VPNs. Additionally, the Chinese government introduced these measures in conjunction with vast economic reforms, which saw home ownership rates skyrocket and the price of daily goods drop significantly. I am not saying that we must give up freedoms to get positive societal change, but I know many in the UK would understandably have little concern with more surveillance if that meant they could buy a home and pay for their energy bills. But that's not going to happen in the UK. Here in the UK, we have these restrictions imposed on us while seeing our costs skyrocket and home ownership rates drop. To me, there is no reality where the government will not eventually use this to decide what we see, whether that's to protect their own image or the interests of their private donors. I struggle to believe this will only ever be used for objectively positive purposes. We are already seeing additional suggestions from the government, including installing surveillance software on every new mobile device in the UK. This would be an incredible overreach of power and would guarantee we have no privacy online. If something like this takes effect, I genuinely don't know where we go from there. I actually think that increasing surveillance and protections is not automatically the worst idea. I simply have little faith in this or any British government to ensure it goes in line with improvements to our standards of living, or that it doesn't lead to overreach and systemic abuses of power. If fundamental protections are put in place, I will support the implementation of some of these measures, as there are areas where we need more barriers in place, but the current trajectory raises a number of worrying concerns. Holding on to our freedoms is an essential fight we must partake in. If we want to have the freedom to organise, protest, and fight back against the injustices we face here in the UK, we must ensure that the internet and our digital lives are not surveyed at every step by the government. If this happens in its full potential, we will have handed over power to people most of us did not elect, carrying out policy no one campaigned on and nobody voted for.